people in there. 1, 2, 3, 4,
All
5.
right. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to this program that is brought to you by the North Shore Programming Consortium, which consists of 6 local libraries, which are Bayville, Glen Cove, Gold Coast, Locust Valley, Oyster Bay, and Seacliff. We have come together to bring our patrons more of a variety in adult programming in a more cost-effective way. Our next program after this evening is on Tuesday, May 27th at 7 p.m. on women who took a back seat to their artist lovers, which sounds very juicy. Please go to your library's webpage to register for that event Locust Valley will be hosting. Today's program is hosted by the Bayville Free Library, and out of respect to our presenter and other participants, we kindly ask that you remain muted during the program. Feel free to type any questions in the chat, and they will be addressed during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, here is Patty Hamrick, our presenter, with a fantastic program on fake archaeology. Thank you, Patty.
Thank you so much for that introduction. My name is Patty Hamrick, and I have an MA in archaeology from New York University. And one of the most prominent places that you might hear about archaeology in pop culture these days is very unfortunately with what I've called fake archaeology. And one of the most prominent examples of fake archaeology probably is the TV show Ancient Aliens. I don't know if any of you guys have watched that or heard of it. I do have to admit, I've watched some episodes myself, so don't feel too guilty if you're a fan. It can be a very fun way to spend time. If you haven't watched Ancient Aliens, if you haven't heard of it, it's currently just finished its 21st season, so quite popular, and it gets up to 1 million viewers an episode. Another example of some quite prominent fake archaeology is we have the Indiana Jones movies. And I thought I'd start off this talk with talking about an example of a freaky artifact that was in one of the Indiana Jones movies, in the 4th one, which is the one that came out about 10 years ago, called Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. So we're going to be talking about crystal skulls. Again, probably a very, very well-known type of, some people say it's aliens, some people say, it's magical, different explanations depending on who you ask. There is the crystal skulls are prominent enough that not only was there an Indiana Jones movie about it, but they also feature in the credit sequence for Ancient Aliens. And there are indeed real crystal skulls throughout the world. These are a couple of ones that actually belong to different museums. This one at the top belongs to the Smithsonian. This one belongs to the Musée de Quai Branly in Paris. And this is probably the most famous example. It belongs to the British Museum. This is probably the one that has been studied the most. We first have evidence of it from 1881, although of course it claims to be hundreds, if not thousands of years old. And where it first appears in the historical record is not, as you might think, in some deep jungle or in an archaeological website. But in fact, the very first place we have evidence for this was in the store of an art dealer, which is already a little bit suspicious on its own. No museum was willing to buy from this art dealer. None of them kind of believed that it was real. And he eventually sold it to Tiffany's, the jewelry company. And the British Museum was the one who bought it directly from Tiffany's. So not a great record of sales if, you're looking for real evidence of this, in fact, being an ancient artifact. And another very, very famous crystal skull, one that is very similar to the British Museum one, they look almost identical, is this one. And this one is nicknamed the Mitchell-Hedges skull, and that is the name of the guy who found it, or supposedly found it. The very first place that evidence for this skull turns up is in a book written by this guy, Mitchell-Hedges. He wrote this book in 1954. And at the time, he doesn't say where it came from. He just says he has this skull. He says it was 3,600 years old and that it is the embodiment of all evil. He said that it had originally belonged to the high priest of the Maya who could use it to summon death. So there's a couple of problems with this. First of all, one of them is that the Maya were not around 3,600 years ago. They are not that old. They were kind of more in the Middle Ages, so much more recent than 3,600 years ago. They didn't really have a high priest because they were not a single empire. They were a bunch of independent, different city-states. So, some even if you accept that, it could summon death and that it could do these magic spells, there's already some problems with it. Later on, we got more details about where this guy had supposedly found the crystal skull. And he said it came from an archaeological dig at a Mayan city called Lubatan, which is in Belize. And specifically, he said it was his daughter. Here is a photo of her. Her name was Anna. And specifically that she supposedly was the one who actually dug it up. And she found it on her 17th birthday, which was in 1924. So that is 4 different crystal skulls that are probably the most famous 4 of them. But how many are there total? Well, it depends on who you ask. Some people say only these 4 count as the real crystal skulls. Some people say there's 12 of them. According to this episode of Ancient Aliens that I've got a picture of up here on the screen, there are 13. And when all 13 are reunited in one place, a magical event will happen. But if we're just defining this as a skull made out of crystal, there are hundreds of thousands of them. You guys have probably seen these for sales in stores yourself all over the place. You can find miniature or full-size crystal skulls in huge amounts of abundance. So it's very hard to decide, how many of these count as a real crystal skull. It depends on who you ask. This also, one thing you might hear about these crystal skulls very often is that they can't be reproduced with modern technology. But again, there are modern ones all over the place. In fact, we find it quite easy to reproduce these with modern technology. Another question is, where did they come from? So most commonly today, they will claim to be associated with either the Mayans or the Aztecs. So one of these Middle America, Mesoamerica type civilizations. So for instance, that's where this Mitchell Hedges said he found his in a Maya city. This one that is now owned by the British Museum first turned up in a art dealer's shop. The shop was in Mexico. So like Mexico, Central America, this is where you tend to see them being claimed to come from currently. But in fact, in the 1800s, when the first ones of these started to show up, a lot of them were claimed to have come from Pacific islands. So things like Tahiti or Easter Island. Another thing, a lot of times in the 1800s, people claimed they came from Tibet, that they had something to do with this, Dalai Lama and this mysterious Buddhism. You almost never see that anymore. So that's kind of another piece of evidence against them, that this idea of where they're coming from is changing over time. But let's talk more about this one in particular, the Mitchell Hedges skull. As I said, this is the most famous of them. And it is called Mitchell Hedges skull because it is named after the guy who found it, or said he found it, a guy named F.A. Mitchells. And he was a celebrity in the early 1900s. He wrote a lot of books. He also had a radio show in the 1930s. And he was kind of like a real-life Indiana Jones, or at least that was his career, that he would write these books, he would tell these stories that he claimed were things that really had happened to him. And they were all these exciting adventure stories about, discovering ancient cities or hunting lions and tigers or, being chased by these savage people and he just barely got away with his life. Very exciting, very dramatic, probably not very real stories, but he was a pretty well-known name in the early 1900s. And in particular, the book where he first mentions this skull is called Danger My Ally, which I think is a great name. It should definitely be the name of a James Bond novel or movie. And so this is the map at the front of Danger My Ally. And so you can see here is the lost city of Louboutin, which is here in Belize. As I said, that is supposedly where this crystal skull came from. And you can see another thing on this map, though, is Atlantis. So according to this guy, not only did he find a crystal skull, he also found where Atlantis is. And it's in Honduras, by the way, if you wanted to go and visit Atlantis. So once people began to actually research this story, there turned up some quite large holes in it. So for instance, his daughter Anna, who supposedly was the one who dug up this skull, turned out she had never been to the city of Louboutin. And in fact, there turned up a receipt where this guy, Mitchell Hedges, had not found the skull himself, but he, in fact, had bought it from someone else in the year 1943. So supposedly 20 years after he found it. And the people he bought it from was Sotheby's. And you can see here the picture of it in the Sotheby's catalog. It is extremely, extremely similar to the one in the British Museum. And as I said, so similar that it's thought it's probably a copy of the one in the British Museum. In recent days, not only can we point to these problems like, receipts and that all the details of this guy's story don't match up, but we've been able to do some quite advanced scientific studies of these crystal skulls to kind of try and answer the question of, are these really as ancient as their supporters claim? So one thing that is a problem is we have found what both of these skulls, the British Museum skull and the Mitchell Hedges skull, are made out of quartz. And in particular, they're made out of quartz that can be traced to one specific mine in Brazil. Now, the problems with this is neither the Mayans nor the Aztecs had any trade connection to Brazil. There was not raw materials going back and forth between Mesoamerica and Brazil. So there's no way they would have gotten this quartz. In addition, no one was digging up these mines. There's no evidence of these mines in Brazil being used by anyone until the early 1800s. Seems to be the very first time quartz was discovered in this region of Brazil. So the 1800s is obviously well after the Mayans and the Aztecs. Another problem is when you look at the skulls under very, very high-powered microscopes. They do not look like artifacts that are actually belonging to the Mayas or the Aztecs. So for instance, here is a crystal goblet that does actually is from ancient Mexico around the time of the Mayans. And here is the British Museum crystal skull. So these are both crystal, and if you thought these were both made by the Mayans, they should show very similar techniques of how they were made. But actually, when you look at these under a very, very high-powered microscope, what you find for the actual Mayan goblet, this evidence of the carving and of the polishing is very, very random. You can see these little lines left behind by the materials they used to polish them are kind of all over in every direction. When we look under a microscope at how the crystal skull was polished, you can see it looks very, very different. These lines are much, much smoother, much smaller, and they're all parallel. In fact, these kinds of lines are what you would get only using high-speed rotary tools, which unsurprisingly the Mayans do not have. And as a method for polishing, as the abrasive, they probably use something like diamond dust or silicon carbide to leave these sorts of marks. Again, no evidence of anything like that being used by the Mayas or the Aztecs. They have a much, much rougher, much more handmade kind of marks left in their evidence of the objects they did actually make. So if the Mayans and the Aztecs didn't make the crystal skulls, who did? Well, all of the evidence, the fact that this quartz came from Brazil, the types of tools they used to make it, the dates when they begin appearing in the mid to late 1800s, really point to one city in Germany in particular. And it's a city called Idar-Oberstein. And in the late 1800s, this area became very, very famous for carving gemstones. In fact, it is still famous for carving gemstones. They have a whole museum about it. This area in Germany was connected to Brazil by immigration. A lot of people and a lot of trade went back and forth between Germany and Brazil. And you can see they clearly had very, very highly skilled people in carving crystal and gems and jewelry. You can see here these different like bugs and flowers. They were very good at putting into jewelry, and they therefore would have been able to make something like the crystal skulls. It is now thought that the one in the British Museum was probably made in the 1870s, so only about a decade before it showed up in this art dealer's store. And the Mitchell Hedges skull indeed probably is a copy of the British Museum one, and it was probably made in the 1930s. Now, I don't know how many of you came to this today believing in crystal skulls, thinking they were really made by ancient aliens or anything, but there might be more believers of ancient aliens than you think. In fact, there is a really interesting survey that is done every year. It's called the Chapman University Survey of American Fears. And they ask thousands of Americans about different things they're afraid of or different things they believe in. And one of the questions they asked is, do you think aliens have visited the Earth in our ancient past? And so you might be able to see here about 7% of people said they strongly agree with that statement, and about 35% of people said they agree. So in total, that's 42.7% of people said they believe aliens have, in fact, really visited Earth. 42.7, and this is from 2021. There have been surveys more recently, but the more recent ones didn't ask about ancient aliens, unfortunately. And so from this 2021, though, and from earlier surveys, we actually can see the numbers are going up. So the first time this survey asked about ancient aliens was in 2015. And at that time, 20% of people agreed with the statement. In 2016, it went up to 27. In 2017, it went up to 35. In 2018, it was up to 41. And as I said, it's now at, or most recently, it was at 42.7. So it's getting larger. The numbers are getting bigger every single time they ask. Part of this is almost certainly due to things like the TV show Ancient Aliens and other pop culture, YouTube videos, podcasts, whatever, about this idea of aliens building the pyramids and aliens making these crystal skulls. But it is not a brand new thing. And in fact, this idea of fake archaeology goes back at least a decade, or excuse me, at least a century, which is about as long as archaeology itself as an academic discipline has been around. And I want to tell you guys about two early fake archaeology cases near from kind of the beginning of archaeology really beginning to be studied. And the first one I want to talk about is called Piltdown Man. You guys maybe have heard of this. It's fairly famous. This is a human ancestor that was found in England in 1912. And it was found in the small town of Piltdown, which is where it gets its name. And this, when it was first found, was, as I said, considered to be a human ancestor. It was very often called the missing link between humans and apes. So if you've heard that phrase, missing link, this is where it comes from. It did have a scientific name. It was called Eoanthropus dawsoni, which means Dawson's Dawn Man. So the guy who found it was named Dawson, and then Dawn Man is like from the dawn of time. And this was a huge deal. This was an enormous discovery. These are two headlines of the New York Times, just two examples out of many. Front page news worldwide when it was found. For 41 years, from 1912 when it was found until the 1950s, this was considered, a very important piece of human evolution until it was exposed as a total fraud in 1953. So what happened and who did this? How did they get away with it? The person who found this, as I said, was a guy named Dawson, Charles Dawson. This is him with the arrow pointing to him. And he made this discovery in 1912, which is not so long after Charles Darwin wrote his books about evolution. Charles Darwin, his first book about evolution called On the Origin of Species came out in 1859. And then his book where he's talked specifically about human evolution called The Descent of Man came out in 1871. So about 40 years before this. And it was hugely, hugely controversial. I mean, evolution is still pretty controversial, but at the time, even among scientists and archaeologists, people weren't quite sure if they were ready to follow along in Darwin's footsteps. This guy Dawson, though, he was not a scientist or an archaeologist or a paleontologist or anything else like that. He was a lawyer, but he had a lot of interest in history and in science. And even though he was only an amateur, he really wanted to make some kind of discovery that would get him recognized and would make him famous, and that the real scientists would kind of take him seriously. So he was the one who discovered this skull in a quarry where people were digging up stones to use in buildings and things like that. And this was before radiocarbon dating was invented, or any really sort of scientific dating. And the reason why they could tell the skull was so old is right next to it, they found some bones of extinct animals, things like hippopotamus and elephants. And obviously, elephants do not live in England. Elephants have not lived in England for many, many years, back since the Ice Age. And they figured since these were all together, they must be all from around the same time. So this human skull is probably from the Ice Age also. This was not the first human ancestor that was found. In fact, there were already a couple of other groups of ancestors that had been found already by this time. One of them was what they called Java Man, because it was found on the island of Java, which today is part of Indonesia, but at the time it was a Belgian colony. And this is what we today would call Homo erectus. There also had been Neanderthals. I'm sure you guys have all been heard of Neanderthals. And the Neanderthal bones had been found in places like Germany, France, Belgium. And they had also found what they called Cro-Magnon. Today, we consider Cro-Magnons to be part of our same species. They're also Homo sapiens, just like we are. They're just a slightly older version. And these Cro-Magnons have been found in places like France, the Habsburg Empire, Italy. So one thing you might notice about this list of places is that pretty much all the superpowers of the late 1800s and early 1900s had found their own human ancestors in their own countries, all of them except for England. England had made no discoveries. So when this Piltdown Man was found in England, it was really a chance for England to kind of step up and be on the same level as all these other superpowers. One thing today, when we think about human evolution and where you might expect to find early fossils, of course, we all think of Africa, but none of the fossils in Africa had been found yet at this time. They would not begin to discover the African connections until the 1920s, after this had happened. So another important thing when they discovered Piltdown Man is they estimated it was about 500,000 years old, which would make it way, way older than any of these other groups of people. So scientists in England who had been kind of feeling left out, now they had a chance to have their own human ancestor, and also their human ancestor was older than anybody else's. So they really felt like they were now, the leaders in the race. And that was one of the reasons why Piltdown became so popular, because the English, really saw it as kind of like a patriotic thing to believe in Piltdown. Another reason why Piltdown became so popular is it actually matched the theory of what people had expected to find with human evolution better than any of the other fossils that were being found did. So this is an example of what I'm talking about. Here we have 3 skulls. One of them is a Neanderthal skull. One of them is a modern day human skull. And one of them is this Homo erectus, also called Java Man. Can you guys guess which one is the modern human? You want to unmute yourself for a sec, or you can type it in the chat window. Anybody got a guess? Ruth says the middle one. Very, very good. This isn't really such a hard question. Yeah, the middle one. That looks like the skull we see if you watch, medical dramas on TV, if you see Halloween decorations. This is kind of the skull we're expecting to see. And both of these skulls, this is a Neanderthal up here on top and the Homo erectus on the bottom. Both of those look much more kind of monkey-like, much more animal-like. Now, if we look from the neck down, though, instead of at the skulls, can you tell which one of these three is the modern human? Again, we have modern human, Neanderthal, and Homo erectus. Ruthie says the one on the right. Heidi says the one on the left. So we've got exactly opposite opinions. Somebody says our right. Any other guesses? Yeah, so it's much, much harder to tell when we're looking at the skeletons, when we're looking from the neck down. The differences are much, much smaller. In fact, it's this guy over here, the one with the black background, is the modern human skeleton. Joseph, by the way, said the one in the middle. The one in the middle is actually that Homo erectus, also called Java man. And this guy over here is the Neanderthal. So it's much, much harder to tell the difference when you're looking from the neck down. They are very similar from the neck down. And so what this means is that our body evolved into something that looks pretty much like a modern day body earlier than our brain did. Our brain came late. Again, if we look at these three, our brains was one of the last things to really evolve, the most recent things to evolve. And this is the exact opposite of what scientists in the 1800s and early 1900s had thought would happen. They thought that the brain should come first because that's what makes humans unique, and that's what makes humans different from all the other animals, that we're so much more intelligent. So we should have a big brain first, and then the rest of the body, stuff like walking upright on two legs or having opposable thumbs, all of that stuff should have come later. And that is not what they were finding with Neanderthal and Homo erectus and Cro-Magnons. That they were finding the body came first and the brain came later. And this is one of the reasons why they liked Piltdown Man, because if we compare Piltdown Man to these other skulls, you can see it has a very, very big brain, a very, very kind of modern sized brain, a lot of space in there for the smart stuff. But the face looks very, very monkey-like or animal-like. It's got this it's got fangs. First of all, you can see it's got these big teeth. Obviously, modern humans, we do not have big old canines hanging out. It's got this kind of almost muzzle-like bit where like the kind of mouth is projecting, and it has a very, very receding thing underneath it. Whereas humans, of course, we have chins. Chins are one of the unique things about modern humans that really distinguishes us from other animals. So this Piltdown, the fact that the brain was big, but the rest of it looked more animal-like, is really what scientists had expected to see. And so when that's what seemed to be in Piltdown Man, that's one of the reasons why they supported it, because it matched their theories. Of course, not everyone agreed. There were some few skeptics right away. But the people who did support it, for instance, this arrow is pointing at a guy named G.E. Smith, who was a very famous archaeologist at the time. He wrote a lot of textbooks that were used to teach people archaeology. And he said about this Piltdown skull, man at first was merely an ape with an overgrown brain. The importance of the Piltdown skull lies in the fact that it affords tangible confirmation. So he was literally saying, Piltdown matches my theory, and that's why I like it. That's why I think it's important, and that's why I think it's real. Which obviously, if you want, if you're only going to accept evidence that already matches your theory, you're not going to be a very good scientist. Another reason why Piltdown was popular, especially among the English, is that because it was so different from the Neanderthal and the Java man, they felt like that meant those guys were evolutionary dead ends. And modern humans must have come from the Piltdown man. The Neanderthals, the Java men, they were just kind of side branches that went nowhere. So as I said, we now know this was a total fraud. It was discovered in 1953 when radiocarbon dating was invented. And when this skull was tested, it turned out to be nowhere near as old as they thought it was. It turns out it came in two pieces. The top part, the kind of part with the brain, was actually a human skull. It was only 500 years old. So probably someone had gone and dug up a medieval cemetery and stolen a skull. And the jaw did come from the 19 teens, so it only was a year or two old when it was found, and it actually was an orangutan jaw. So someone had just taken the top part of a human skull and the bottom part of an orangutan jaw and put them together, and then chemically dyed them to make them look older. And yet, somehow, this had managed to fool all kinds of experts for 40 years. So how did it fool so many people? Well, as I've been saying, it's because it really played into the things they wanted, that they wanted a fossil that would make them feel patriotic, and it played into what they expected to see. And that's what we're going to see when we get back to modern day ancient aliens. We're going to see those same ideas repeated a lot, that people kind of see what they expect to see. But another question is, who did it? Could have been any of the people in this photo. A lot of different archaeologists and scientists were involved in discovering it, in certifying it as real, and promoting it. One of the people who is not in this painting, but I think is kind of a fun theory, somebody who lived in the neighborhood where it was found, was Arthur Conan Doyle. You might know he's a very famous writer. He wrote Sherlock Holmes. So we know he is someone who liked riddles, who liked mysteries, who liked puzzles. So perhaps he made this and planted it where he knew archaeologists would find it. And in fact, in another one of his books, The Lost World, he actually wrote about how to fake a fossil. But even though that would be a really fun theory, that's probably not who is the guilty party. The guilty party most likely is the same person who discovered it, this guy named Charles Dawson. He was the only ever person who found pieces. Nobody else ever found them when he wasn't there. As I said, he wasn't a scientist himself. He was an amateur, but who really, really wanted recognition and fame. So he had a lot of motivation. But why did a guy who was not a scientist manage to fool so many real scientists? Well, as I said, it fit into their notions. Another story of old fake archaeology I want to tell you guys is about the city called Great Zimbabwe. So this Great Zimbabwe, it's here on the map. It's in the modern day country of Great Zimbabwe. It was a massive, massive city that was occupied during the Middle Ages from about 1100 to 1450. Between 10,000 and 18,000 people lived in this city. So it was quite a big city for the time period. And it was very important for trade. It had trading connections all over, including as far away as China. And the most remarkable thing about the city of Great Zimbabwe today is it has these massive, massive stone walls around the outer edges of the city. They are 36 feet high, which makes it the biggest antique sculpture or antique structure in Africa south of the Sahara Desert. So just this massive, massive ruin, a whole city with these very, very tall walls all around the outside. So as I said, people lived here in the Middle Ages, but after that, it was abandoned and it was allowed to fall into ruin. Nobody lived there anymore. And it was rediscovered by Europeans and by archaeologists in the late 1800s. At the time, this area was called Rhodesia. It was named after a guy named Cecil Rhodes, and it was a colony that was run by a private company called the British South Africa Company. until 1923, when it passed from the possession of this company into became a British colony under the government of Britain. So this is just like, I mean, imagine if Amazon or Apple or any company conquered several hundreds of miles of land and then just decided to rule this as their own company, you know, with their own money and their own courts and their own laws, all of that. This is basically what happened to Rhodesia. It's called Rhodesia because, as I said, the guy who ran the company was named Cecil Rhodes. So he named it after himself, from Rhodes to Rhodesia. He was not a good guy, as you might imagine. Anyone who goes out and conquers a whole country probably isn't a very nice guy. He named it after himself, which is a sign of a huge ego. He was also very, very racist. The local Africans who had lived there before it, he basically made it impossible for them to own land. He did as much as he could to run them out of the country and bring in white British or other white Europeans to take over the population. He made it more or less impossible for the local Africans to vote. He basically is considered the founder of the apartheid system, which would later grow throughout in South Africa and in other countries. Hitler was a fan of Cecil Rhodes. Hitler really admired him. So anybody who Hitler looks up to, you know, is not a good guy. And the reason why he wanted to conquer Rhodesia is because it had several diamond mines. And that was how Cecil Rhodes made most of his money, through diamonds. He founded the company that is today called De Beers. And if you've heard of Rhodes Scholars or the Rhodes Scholarship, that is also named after him because he donated the money that started the Rhodes Scholarship. So when this Great Zimbabwe was discovered, Cecil Rhodes and other people in his company or running Rhodesia thought that it was impossible that the local Africans could have made something so great, that it was way too impressive to have been built by the Africans. So they tried to come up with other theories of who else could have built it. And one of the theories they really liked was it was built by the Queen of Sheba. And another theory they really liked, you can see in this newspaper article, did the famous Queen of Sheba live there? Another theory they really liked was it was built by Phoenicians. Phoenicians were a group of traders and sailors who lived around the Mediterranean during the same time period as like the ancient Greeks. So if any of you guys know about Dido of Carthage, if you know that story, she was a Phoenician. So basically, these people who were coming from more white areas, they must have come all the way down here into southern Africa and built this great, great city and then disappeared. So you can see this was a tourism poster from the early 1900s. And you can see the local African person here is kneeling down, looking very, very subservient. And then there's kind of a ghost looking very white of this Queen of Sheba, or maybe a Phoenician queen who he's making an offering to. Eventually, it became clear once people began to actually study this, archaeologists, they realized that it was very, very clear that Great Zimbabwe was built by the local people. Once they looked at things other than just the giant stone walls, but once they looked at things like the trash, the ceramics, the clothing, what kind of food the people there ate, what did their houses look like? What kind of tools did they use? All of these very boring things, you know, a bunch of pieces of broken potsherds, you're not going to put that on a tourism poster. It's not very exciting. It's not like this big mystery. But those things like trash can really be what tells you more about the actual people than something like a giant stone wall. Because when they looked at things like the ceramics and the tools, they found they matched exactly the ceramics and tools of the people in the area, not the Phoenicians, not Sheba, not anybody else from the outside, but it matched the locals. Well, once it became clear that this had been built by locals, the government of Rhodesia turned to denying that this was important, that this was a big deal. They really downplayed it as much as possible. I've got a quote from one archaeologist who worked for the government at the time, She described Great Zimbabwe as the product of an infantile mind built by a subjugated society. So once they admitted that it was built by Africans, they downplayed the achievement of it. And they continued this up until the 1970s, that they would not allow any sort of mention in books, in museums, in newspapers, any sort of public mention of things like radiocarbon dates, which it proved it took place way, way after the Phoenicians, way, way after the Queen of Sheba supposedly lived. Any bits of these evidence that would stray away from the story they wanted to tell. And this became popular. I don't know if any of you guys have ever heard of Great Zimbabwe before. It's not particularly famous today, but this idea of there being a lost Phoenician city or a lost white city somewhere in the depths of Africa was a very, very common piece of pop culture in the Victorian age. And one author in particular wrote several books around this kind of basic idea, a guy named H. Rider Haggard. And two of his books were called King Solomon's Mines, and another one was called She. These were immensely popular books. Again, they're not very well known today. I don't know if any of you have read either of these or any of the other books by Haggard, but he was hugely popular in the Victorian age. In fact, She in particular is one of the best-selling novels of all time. Like the immense numbers of times the number of people who read this book. It was made into a movie 11 times, 11 different movie versions of this. Of course, this was mostly like back in the silent movie days or the black and white movie days. It has not been made into a movie anytime recently, but still 11 different movies. King Solomon's Mines was made into 6 different movies. So these were hugely popular stories, which have mostly been forgotten today. But both of these stories are kind of the same idea that somewhere in deepest, darkest Africa, there is this secret kingdom of white people that is ruled by a queen, and she has all these treasures and jewels and gold. And, you know, she's kind of hidden away like an ancient civilization that's lost contact with the outside world. Well, when Zimbabwe finally became independent, it became independent in 1980. It really, the people who lived in Zimbabwe, the people who would become the new government of Zimbabwe, they had been very hurt by this downplaying of the achievements of their history and taking away their history from the people it really belonged to. So that is one of the reasons why Zimbabwe, the country, has its name, that it is named after this archaeological discovery. It is named after the site of Great Zimbabwe. And this is what the flag of Zimbabwe today looks like. And you might notice it has this kind of funny looking bird on it. And this is from one of the things found at Great Zimbabwe, that there is this metal statue of a bird. And they felt, you know, such a great connection to this ancient city and to how this ancient city had been erased that they put it on the flag. And it is still there on the Zimbabwe flag today. So I think Piltdown and the Great Zimbabwe, these are interesting stories, not just because I think they're interesting in and of themselves, but I think it illustrates several things that are in common with ancient alien theories still today. And one of the things is that very, very often, ancient aliens, you watch it and they'll say, look at this, whatever it is, look at this city, look at this piece of technology, look at this pyramid. Ancient people couldn't have done this. It's too advanced. It's too complex. So someone else must have come in from the outside and done it for them. And although today, usually we don't say, oh, well, white people came in and did it. Usually they say, oh, aliens came in and did it. But the basic premise really hasn't changed, that we don't believe ancient people were smart enough or good enough to have done this on their own, that they must have had help from somewhere else. And another theory that is very common is sometimes something looks mysterious if you look at it all by itself. So if you look at just the stone walls of Great Zimbabwe, or if you look at just the Piltdown skull by itself, it looks very mysterious. But if you look at the context around it, so if you look at things like broken ceramics and hand tools and clothing and writing and all of these details that are kind of boring, honestly. Like, I understand why nobody wants to watch a TV show about broken pots, but you need those broken pots to tell you a lot about the people who made and lived in these ancient sites, because that's where you'll be able to find how did they do it, and how did they learn to do it, how did they know to do it, as opposed to just like, well, it must have come from aliens. You have to look at kind of the boring parts as well. So, to give you an example of how connected these stories are to modern day ancient aliens, there's a guy, we're going to talk about him more in a few minutes, named Eric von Daniken. And in a lot of ways, we can kind of credit him for really popularizing the idea of ancient aliens. He's really the person who we can kind of blame it all on. And he wrote a lot of books about ancient aliens. And in one of his books called Signs of the Gods, he says, do the great ruins of Zimbabwe point to an impossibly detailed knowledge of astronomy? And what he means is, oh, these African people couldn't have known that much about space, so it must have been aliens. But you can see how, word for word, this exactly sounds like something that Cecil Rhodes might have said, that, oh, these Africans couldn't have known that much about space, it must have been Phoenicians. Like, very, very little has changed. So let's look at a couple of examples from Ancient Aliens. This is a very, very common example that comes up in, it's been on Ancient Aliens, the TV show. There have been all kinds of books and YouTube videos and websites about this piece of art. If you have ever looked up anything about Ancient Aliens, you have probably seen this piece of art. So this is a photograph of it, but it's kind of hard to see the details in the photograph. So this is a black and white sketch of the same thing. This black and white sketch actually comes from the Ancient Aliens put out a coloring book, and this is one of the pages in the coloring book. But they copied the art quite, directly. They didn't change too much, and it's much easier to see in the black and white. So according to Ancient Aliens, what is this a picture of? Like, it is very hard to see. Like, when you guys, I know it looks abstract. It's hard to know what this is. Like, there's all kinds of weird things going on. So according to Ancient Aliens, what this is it's a spaceship. So here are the thrusters down at the bottom. Here is the guy in the middle. And he supposedly, all of these things are like the different control panels that he is controlling. And then he's sitting in kind of a reclined seat to help him deal with the lack of gravity. And that is what this piece of art is showing. It's showing a human in a spaceship. What this piece of art actually is it's a sarcophagus that belonged to a Maya king named Pakal. So our sarcophagus is like the top lid of a coffin with a bunch of fancy carvings on it. Pakal, I said he was a king of the Maya, of a Mayan city called Palenque. He's sometimes called Pakal the Great because he was a very important king. His full name was Keniche Janab Pakal the First. He was born in March 603 in the city of Palenque, which is in modern-day Mexico. And at the time he was born, the king of Palenque was his grandfather's brother. So quite a lot of distance between him and his great uncle. You wouldn't necessarily thought Pakal would be the guy to inherit the throne, but there were no other male heirs. So when his grandfather died, Pakal became king. That was in October 1612, and he was only 9 years old, Pakal, at the time. So he couldn't really become king yet because a 9-year-old is maybe not who you want making your government decisions. And instead, his mother took over the throne. Her name was Lady, oops, sorry, let me move it. Lady Sak Kuuk, and she reigned in her own name for several years. And then Pakal was officially crowned in July 615. But Lady Sak Kuuk continued as a very powerful force in the government for the next 25 years. Pakal himself ruled until he was 80, and he died in August 683. That means he was king for 68 years, That makes him one of the longest running kings in all of human history. He is only number 5 in terms of the longest rule. While he was king, he conducted several wars with other Mayan cities. He really took Palenque from kind of a fairly small backward place to a really major power in the Maya politics. He also built several very important buildings. He built temples, he built a palace, and he also built the pyramid in which he is buried in. So I tell you all of this about Pakal because clearly we know a lot about Pakal. This is someone we have a lot of history about. We have a lot of writings about Pakal and about other people who lived in the city at the time or in other cities he went to war with. So if Pakal had like disappeared to go flying around in space for several years, we would know about it. And when you see this piece of art on things like Ancient Aliens, they usually don't even tell you what his name is. They treat him as just kind of an anonymous background person who could be flying a spaceship. But this isn't just like anybody thrown into a spaceship. This is a very well-known and very famous figure who, like, we would know if he had gone off of aliens, somebody would have written it down. Another thing that is important is some of the rest of the art going on here, the style of the art. So one of the things you might notice is behind him, he has this thing that sort of is vaguely in the shape of a cross. And this is a very, very common symbol in Maya art and all Mesoamerican art. It's called the world tree. And this is kind of seen to be a tree that kind of holds the whole world together. Here are several other pieces of art that all have this world tree. And so it is thought that the branches are kind of up in heaven, and that's where like the gods live and the cosmic powers live. Then the trunk is the mortal world, that's where we all are living. And then the roots are kind of the underworld and the world of the dead. So you very often will see it kind of, has the branches just at the top, doesn't have any branches in the middle because it's about the trunk, and then really exaggerated roots to show you that it's the underworld. Very often you will have a bird on the top. You can see all of these have birds, and the bird kind of represents the gods or the cosmic powers. And at the bottom, you will have often like a monster. You can see there's a monster kind of here in the roots. If I zoom in here, you can see there's a skeleton in the roots here. And that's because that's the underworld, or that's the world of the dead. So you've got monsters and skeletons down there. Another thing you very often see, it's kind of doesn't look that much like a tree. It kind of looks more like a cross. And that is because it's also meant to symbolize the 4 arms of the cross, top, bottom, left, and right, are meant to symbolize the 4 directions, north, south, east, and west. So it has this very exaggerated kind of cross look. And again, if we look at that with Palenque, you can see again here, he's got one of these birds up on the top. You can see here's its beak, here's its legs, here's its tail. So we've got a bird on top. Then here we've got the branches, one on the left and one on the right. Then here we've got the trunk. And then down here, we've got the roots and the mouth of a monster. You can see it a little better if I separate out how it's very much the fangs, the mouth of a monster. And so, as I said, this is his sarcophagus. So this is meant to represent him dying. And it makes a lot of sense that we are seeing him falling from the trunk of the tree, which is where living people are, and he's falling down into the roots and into the mouth of the monster, which is where the dead are. So he's going from the trunk with humans down to the world of the dead in the roots. So these pieces are not parts of a spaceship. They're this very, very common symbol in Mayan art and other Mesoamerican art of the world tree. Another thing we see, if we look very closely at what he's sitting on top of, again, supposedly, according to Ancient Aliens at least, this is some sort of spaceship chair recliner. It is not. And these are not just kind of random shapes, but these are shapes we, again, can identify because they're in a lot of other Mayan art. So this shape kind of here, this kind of seashell-y looking thing, it is in fact a seashell. And specifically, it's a specific kind of seashell that the Mayans really valued highly. It's called a spiny oyster. And what they did with it in particular is they used it to make sacrifices. Now, you might have heard that the Mayans did a lot of human sacrifice, cut out people's hearts or beheaded people. They did do some human sacrifice, but they didn't really do that much. What was much more common is for them to do blood sacrifice. And this was especially considered the job of the nobility, the king, the rulers, and the priests. And so what they would do is they would cut themselves, bleed a little bit, and then offer up that blood, usually by burning it, and the smoke would go up to the gods. And they felt that like by giving their blood to the smoke, that kind of feeds the gods. And in return, the gods make the plants grow and the animals grow so that we have stuff to eat and that it's, reciprocal. So spiny oysters, they are very, very sharp. And they are one of the things they would use to cut to do these blood sacrifices. And they're also red naturally, which kind of symbolize the blood to them. This thing in the middle is a stingray spine. And a stingray spines were another thing they used to cut for these blood sacrifices. So we're seeing Pakal displayed along with these different sacrificial tools. So it's kind of like himself, not just a little bit of blood, but his whole body, his whole life is being offered as a sacrifice to the gods here, which again makes sense on someone's tomb. All of these things up and down the trunk of the tree, these kind of weird little spirals and circles, they're also all around the edges. These are not just random doodles, or they're also not spaceship controls. This is what Mayan writing looks like. The Mayans used hieroglyphs, and this is what the hieroglyphs looked like. In particular, these ones on the trunk, this one is the word for mirror, and this one is the word for water lily. And these are both things that were associated with the supernatural, with death, and with, dying, with the moment of death. Another thing Ancient Aliens really likes to point out is he has this kind of weird little triangle on his nose. And you can see here again where they're claiming it's a spaceship. They're claiming that this is some sort of oxygen apparatus to let him breathe in space. That's what this is. Again, Ancient Aliens is wrong. What this is represented is his breath. And again, this is very common. If you're used to Mayan art, you're used to seeing this. So we can see it like here. You can see this guy has another little kind of shape coming out of his nose. This guy here has multiple little shapes coming out of his nose. This one here has a little kind of T shape coming out of his nose. This guy here in the corner, he has, it kind of almost looks like fangs. That's actually meant to be the air coming out of his mouth. So it was very common in Mayan art to actually show people's breath. And that is what is happening here with Pakal. And the reason why they did this is they saw the breath kind of as like the soul or the spirit of the person, that was an important part of, not just the body, but actually getting the spiritual part of the person as well and showing that in the art also. And they really thought that, especially the way they marked the difference between life and death was the last breath. We might say if someone asks you, when exactly does someone die? We might say, oh, when your heart stops beating. Or we might say when you have no more brain activity. But for the Mayans, it was really, really about the last breath. And so again, on this guy's coffin, showing his last breath, you can see why that was very, very important. So once you know the context, once you know all of the concepts of religion and the world and death and souls, once you know all of this kind of more boring stuff, you look at this and you don't see mystery, and you definitely don't see a spaceship, but you can understand how this makes sense for the people who made it. It's only by erasing all of that and pretending not to know what this says, or pretending not to know what these things he's sitting on top of are. It's only when you erase all of that that there becomes a hole that you can fill in with aliens. So it's again, taking things out of context. Another thing that is very, very common in ancient aliens is they will compare two things from two different parts of the world and say, look, these two things are exactly the same. And there's no way these two cultures had contact with one another. So it must have been aliens who, told both of these groups of people. And one of the very common things you hear this about is pyramids. People will say, well, how did the Egyptians and the Mayans build pyramids when the Egyptians and the Mayans never had any contact? Well, it must have been aliens came and taught them both how to build pyramids. And this is a very, very common thing you will see. I took this chart online. This is just one I randomly picked. There are hundreds of different versions of this saying that, there are pyramids all over the world and it's a mystery. Why are there so many pyramids? I could have used many other examples of this. If you Google like world pyramids or something, you will find many, many versions of this. I just picked this version randomly. So if it's a mystery about why are there so many pyramids, let's look at each one of these on this chart individually. First of all, pyramids are a very, very simple shape. Like, it's basically just a three-dimensional triangle. Like, it's not hard to figure out how to build a pyramid. If any of you were to just make a stack of rocks, it would probably be in a pyramid shape. I don't feel like we need aliens to teach us how to make pyramids. And again, this is only mysterious when you look at them out of context. If you were to look at things like the trash and the ceramics and the tools and the writing, this would no longer seem mysterious. And so we're kind of going to do a very brief version of that. So first of all, I've circled these 4 pyramids because these are all from Egypt. And I feel like it's kind of cheating to put Egypt on there 4 times. Like, it's not a mystery that if the Egyptians could build 1 pyramid, they could build 4 pyramids. So I felt like that's not really fair to have all 4 of them. In addition, this one that I've circled, this is a pyramid from Rome. It was built in the year 12 BCE. And at the time, Egypt was a colony of Rome. You guys probably all know about, Antony and Cleopatra and how Octavian came in and conquered Egypt. So it's not surprising that some of those Romans who went to Egypt as soldiers or in the government saw pyramids. And when they got back to Rome, they were like, oh, yeah, I'll build one myself. Like, that's not a mystery. You don't need to involve aliens to understand how that happened. And in fact, if we look at this one here on the pyramid or on the chart, if we look at that as a photo in modern day, you see it's not really that impressive. It's only about 100 feet tall. You can see the cars here for scale. It's not really, it wouldn't take aliens, I feel like, to build this. So let's go ahead and X those off. These next 2 I've circled. Both of these are in Mexico. So again, I feel like it's kind of cheating to put Mexico on more than one time. So if we do compare the pyramids in Egypt to the pyramids of the Mayas and the Aztecs, there's at least 2,000 years between the last Egyptian pyramid and the first Mesoamerican pyramid, which also raises a question. Like, if these were all done by aliens, where did the aliens go for those 2,000 years? Why did they wait around for so long before going to a different part of the world? You would think if it was aliens, they could go everywhere on the planet all at the same time. But another question, when we look at the Maya pyramids, a question that is raised, again, if we look at the context, they are very, very different from the Egyptian pyramids. So this is a Mayan pyramid. It's called the Temple of the Inscriptions. It's found in Palenque, Mexico. This is actually that guy Pakal. We were just looking at his sarcophagus. This is one of the pyramids he built. So one of the things you might know about Mesoamerican pyramids, if you've ever been to a Mayan site or an Aztec site, they have staircases on at least one side. Sometimes they have multiple staircases. And that is because the important thing about the Mesoamerican pyramids is this building on the top. This was a temple. So the reason why the Mayans and the Aztecs built pyramids was because they wanted to go up to the top and they wanted to worship on the top. For the Mayans, some really important religious symbols were mountains and caves. And they saw, you go up a mountain, it's like going closer to the gods. And they saw caves as kind of a connection to the underworld and a connection to the spirits of the dead. So by building a pyramid, you were kind of building your own mountain with a cave on the top. So you could go up and have your own personal cave to worship in and to do things like blood sacrifices in. So sometimes people were buried in the Mayan pyramids, but it mostly are just closed in the middle. There's mostly nothing in the pyramids. They're just full of stone. And the whole point is about the temple on the top. Now, if we compare that to Egyptian pyramids, totally different. Egyptian pyramids do not have staircases on them. You are not really supposed to climb to the top of an Egyptian pyramid because there's nothing up there. All Egyptian pyramids are about burials, that they have hollow parts in the middle where the pharaoh or other important people were buried. And that is what the pyramid is for. It is primarily about burial. And maybe somebody would come and worship at a pyramid occasionally, but the main point is about the burial. In addition, Egyptians didn't really care that much about caves or about mountains. What their religion was very much centered on was the sun. And they kind of saw the shape of the pyramid as like the rays of light coming down from the sun. You can kind of imagine how the pyramid is kind of shaped like that. So although it kind of looks like, similar, once you know the context, once you know why people made it in that shape and what they used it for, it's not really very similar at all. They don't have any connections other than they happen to be kind of vaguely in the same shape. So let's cross those off because I don't feel like there's a mystery. The next three, these are all Mesopotamian temples. And they call them pyramids. On this chart, you can see they're calling them pyramids. But when you look at a picture, it doesn't really look like a pyramid to me. It looks much more like a rectangle than a triangle. These are ziggurats. In particular, this one is the ziggurat of Ur, which is located in Iraq. And again, these are very, very different. First of all, they're not a triangle. Second of all, these were also, the reason why they were important is they would build temples on top of them. So kind of like the Mayan pyramids in that way. But the reason why they did this is not because of mountains. They didn't really care about mountains that much. The reason why they did this is in Mesopotamia, it floods a lot, almost every year. And by building them up on top of these huge, grand platforms, it raised your temple up. So it was not in danger of being flooded. Another reason why they did this is what happened in Mesopotamian temples was supposed to be secret. Nobody was supposed to know about it other than the priests. So by raising it really high up, nobody could look in. Nobody is going to be able to peer down at you from next door. It really emphasized the security and the distance from everyday matters of the temple. So again, kind of similar in look, but very, very different context. So let's go ahead and cross those off too. Again, these three that I've circled, these are all from China. And again, once we look at an actual photograph of them instead of this chart, it doesn't really look anything like the pyramids. I mean, it's kind of pyramid in shape, but there's some pretty significant differences. These were made out of brick, not out of stone. So you can see how, even though they are much younger than the pyramids, they're 3,000 years younger than the pyramids, but they're already kind of melting away and not really holding their shape very well. There's 260 of these. So it's definitely, again, not something where it was like aliens came down and they did it once. There's 260 of them. These are tombs. People are buried in these. Not just the important people, though. Not just the emperors, but people like the emperor's families would have their own one of these. Different important officials, generals, prime ministers, lots of different people got their own one of these pyramids, if you want to call them that. So again, pretty different. Again, I've circled these two because once again, they are connected to each other. So I feel like it's kind of cheating to put two examples of the same thing. These are both Buddhist temples from Southeast Asia. And again, once we look at the picture, it doesn't really look like a pyramid. I mean, it looks very impressive. Like, I would love to go here. This is a Buddhist temple called Borobudur in Indonesia. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But if you saw this picture out of context, I assume your first thought is not, wow, that looks like the Egyptian pyramids. Like, I assume if it wasn't on this chart, that would never occur to you. And the same is true for our very last one down here. This is a pyramid, if you want to call it that, called Morongo Uta. It is in French Polynesia on the island of Rapa Iti, kind of near Tahiti. So it's, down in the Pacific Ocean near Tahiti. And these are two pictures of the same thing, just from different angles. What this actually is a fort. So it's not a temple, it's not a burial. It is a fort because there was a lot of warfare going on at the time. These were built, people fighting over resources. So you could go up to the top of these hills, to this pyramid, and then you could, throw arrows down at the people below you. Very easy to defend, give you an advantage in the fighting. And again, there's a bunch of these. Just on this one island, which is a pretty small island called Rapa Iti, there's 14 of these forts. So again, not really a mystery, not mysterious. And by that point, we've crossed off every single one of these. There's not, once we look at all these mysterious pyramids, we see they don't have very much in common with each other. It's only mysterious if you pretend not to know anything about them and pretend that like there is no evidence for what they were used for, how they were built. Now, some people go the opposite way, and they say the mystery is not these worldwide ones, but the opposite. They say the Egyptian pyramids were unique, that nobody else could have built the Egyptian pyramids. They're so big, they're so technologically complex that even today, we don't know how they did it. And again, this is in fact false. We know pretty much everything you could want to know about how they build it. So for instance, we know where the stones came from. We have evidence of the quarries. The pyramids are built out of limestone, and this is a limestone quarry where you can see here, they very, very clearly had begun to carve out these big rectangular stones to build a pyramid. And then it turned out that they didn't need quite as many as they had begun to carve, so they left them in place, and they are still there to this day. So we know where they got the materials. We know how they turned raw limestone into the sorts of perfect squares you would use for building, that they use tools like metal chisels. The tool this guy is using is called a boning rod, and that was used to make sure surfaces were level. When you say like, oh, but they're so big, see, we have here, they were building wooden scaffolding so they could get up to the heights of the top of a giant statue or the middle of a giant statue or whatever. So very clear evidence of the sort of tools they used, the sort of construction methods they used. Once they had a stone or a statue carved, how did they get it from the quarry to wherever it is located today? Well, we have evidence of that too. They used a lot of rivers because obviously it is easier to move something very, very heavy on water than on land. So a lot of these big quarries, they would are located next to the river. They would put the stones on a boat and then bring it as close as they could to where they were building the pyramid or whatever it was used for. When they did have to move it over land, they used things like sleds. You can see here we've got a big, big statue. It is loaded onto a sled. This guy at the front of the sled is pouring down either water or oil, which would help pack the sand down and make it slipperier. And then we've just got dozens and dozens and dozens of people pulling ropes to drag it along. Not really that mysterious. You don't need like anti-grav technology or anything. Another piece of evidence we have for how they moved these big, big, heavy stones is most of these stones would have had what were called handling bosses. And these were just kind of little sticky out bits that made it easier to hold on, to pull, to kind of fit your fingers in. So you're not dealing with a perfectly flat surface, but you have somewhere where you can kind of get a grip and more easily pull it along. The reason why you don't see these on the finished pyramids is because usually they would put them on the inside so they didn't show once the pyramid was all nice and finished. Or once they got it into place, they would chisel off this boss so it just looked perfectly smooth and featureless. But occasionally they didn't bother. Occasionally they were like, whatever, I'm not getting paid today. And they would leave the bosses still in place. And so we can see this evidence of handles that are very obviously suited to human abilities. If they had some sort of levitation device for aliens, you wouldn't need handles like this. In addition, one of the biggest pieces of evidence that the aliens didn't help them is that the Egyptians did not get it right at the beginning. It took them a while to figure out how to build a pyramid, and we can see them go through the process of figuring that out. This is a photo of the very first ancient Egyptian pyramid. It's called the Step Pyramid of Djoser. Djoser was the name of the pharaoh at the time. And the reason why it's called a step pyramid is you can see it looks like it comes in a series of steps. So this is much easier than building one of the pyramids with smooth sides, because in this, basically all you're doing is building like a rectangular house. And then on top of that, building a slightly smaller rectangular house. And then on top of that, building a slightly smaller rectangular house, and so on for each level. So it's like building one stone house, but a bunch of stone houses on top of each other. So it's not that complicated. It's clearly this would be a first step at figuring out the pyramids. So after this was built, the next pharaoh was a guy named Sneferu. And he wanted that, what we think of when we think of pyramids, that nice smooth side. That's what he wanted to be built. So this was his first attempt. It is called the collapsed pyramid. You can see it was not successful. They only got about halfway through building it before it collapsed. So not so great. About 5 years later, Sneferu tried again. This is what he got that time. This is called the bent pyramid, because you can see they got about halfway up, realized the angle wasn't going to work, and then really kind of abruptly changed the steepness of the angles to kind of try and make it come together. So it's finished. It didn't collapse, but it looks kind of funky. So Sneferu wasn't happy with that either. About 5 years later, he had another pyramid built, and this was finally Egypt's first successful straight-sided pyramid. This is called the Red Pyramid or the North Pyramid. But it still wasn't their greatest example of pyramids. When we think of Egyptian pyramids, we think of the ones at Giza. These pyramids, which are all much, much bigger than Sneferu's pyramid. So it took them a while to figure this out. They didn't get it right on the first try, which again, wouldn't aliens know how to build a pyramid? Would they need to take so many failed attempts? That doesn't really fit the evidence. And in fact, the pyramids, even the Great Pyramid, is not perfect. It is slightly longer on the east side than the west side. Now, not a huge amount. It's only 5 inches difference, so a very tiny degree of difference. You can't tell that it's lopsided by looking at it. But again, you would think aliens would be able to do better than that. Another thing that you see a lot in Ancient Aliens and in similar stuff is what they will call an artifact out of time or an artifact out of place. And they'll say this is something that has been found and there's no way that it could really belong to the time or the place it was found, that it's too advanced, that there's nothing else like it, and there's no way to explain it. So it must have been aliens or time travelers or whatever. And one of the very, very famous examples of this is what's called the Antikythera mechanism. And the most recent Indiana Jones movie, the one that only came out about 2 years ago, is called Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. You can see here behind him on the poster, he has this kind of mysterious dial with kind of ancient writing on it. This is referring to the Antikythera mechanism. They just didn't put Antikythera on the poster or in the title because it's very hard to spell and pronounce. So they just called it the Dial of Destiny instead. This is what it actually looks like. Again, like I said, this is another favorite of Ancient Aliens. It's been on the show several times. I think you can also tell from these screen grabs, apparently you have to have a very bad hairstyle to be allowed to be on the Ancient Aliens TV show. Here's another close-up of it. This is sometimes called the world's first analog computer. And that sounds very impressive, but a slide rule is also an analog computer. So it sounds more impressive than it really is. So what it does is it is meant to track the movements of the sun, the moon, and the planets, and it can predict when eclipses will happen. It was built sometime around the year 100 BCE. And the reason why we have it today is that it was actually on a ship that sank. The shipwreck happened around the year 70 BCE, and then the shipwreck was discovered by archaeologists in the year 1901. So for 2,000 years, it was buried at the bottom of the Mediterranean Ocean. And it was found, the ship happened to be near the island of Antikythera when it sank, and that's where it gets its name from. Antikythera is one of the Greek islands. It's kind of near Crete. So it's in the eastern half of the Mediterranean. And this is what it does. Let me show you. So this is a handle. You turn the handle. And when you turn the handle, all of these gears inside move. There are 37 different gears. All of them are different sizes. And the gears moving shows how the planets move. And you can see this one here is the moon, and you can see how it's spinning. It's going from white, full moon, to black, no moon, and it repeats every month. So it is quite complicated. It is very well made. And like I said, a lot of people, you will very often hear this described as mysterious and unexplainable, and that it couldn't have really been the ancient Greeks who made it, that it must have come from somewhere else, some other people. Now, it is true that we don't have other examples of similar mechanisms. But we have a lot of writing about similar mechanisms. So for instance, the ancient Roman Cicero, around the year 50 BCE, he describes seeing a very, very similar device that he said was built by Archimedes. And the way Cicero describes it, it sounds exactly like the Antikythera mechanism. But we know it was not the Antikythera mechanism because, as I said, he wrote this in 50 BCE, but the shipwreck was in 70 BCE, so 20 years earlier. So there must have been at least two of them because Cicero saw one after this one was already on the bottom of the ocean. In addition, as I said, Cicero said the one he saw was made by a guy named Archimedes. And Archimedes also invented a very similar clockwork mechanism called the odometer. And you would put this on like a carriage or a wagon, and it would count every time the wheel of the wagon went around. And by doing that, it would map exactly what distance the wagon had gone. And they use this for making things like maps or for designing roads, being able to have very, very accurate measurements. And in a lot of ways, it's similar to the Antikythera mechanism because it's about, rotating, and it's about gears that interact with other gears. Now, we have no odometers from ancient Greece or from ancient Rome, but we have drawings of them, we have descriptions of them, we have writings about them. So it's clearly something they knew about, even if we don't actually have the physical object anymore. Similarly, some other things we had around that same time period, there was a guy called Hero of Alexander, and he invented this organ that this windmill, it would be blown by the wind, and it used it to pump air through a series of pipes to make music. So again, it used a lot of gears, used very similar mechanisms. He also, this same guy called Hero of Alexander, he invented the world's first steam engine. Now, it didn't really do anything. The only thing it did was it spun this ball around. But he had clearly come up with this concept of if you heat water, it will make steam, and steam has a lot of energy that you can use to spin other things. Even if he didn't really do anything. He didn't have a steam railroad or a steamboat. Like I said, all he did was spin a ball around. But this concept of using gears and using these tiny clockwork devices was clearly very well established in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. The reason why none of these things have actually survived in their physical objects, like we have the writings, we have the drawings, but we don't have any other physical objects other than the Antikythera mechanism. And the reason why that is because these all would have been made out of metal. They would have been very delicate, very easy to break. And in the ancient world, when something is made out of metal and it broke, or you just got tired of it, you didn't throw it away because metal is valuable. So you would melt it down and use it to make something new. For the very same reason, we have very, very few metal statues from ancient Greece or ancient Rome. Now, when you think about ancient Greece and ancient Rome's beautiful statues are probably one of the first things you think of. But most of the ones we have today are made out of marble or made out of other stones. We have very, very few ones made out of metal. And the few we do have mostly come from shipwrecks. Because again, if you have a big hunk of metal lying around, you're not just going to ignore it for 2,000 years. You would reuse that metal. And that is probably why we have very, very few physical examples, even though we have lots of evidence of the Greeks having the capability to make these things. Some more reasons why this is definitely not alien technology. So I said this measures the movements of the planets. It only has 5 planets. Now, we might disagree whether or not Pluto is a planet, but definitely there should be at least 8 of them, and this only has 5. But 5 is exactly how many planets the ancient Greeks knew about. They knew about Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and they didn't know about any of the others. In addition, it's not entirely accurate. Like, it's pretty good. It'll get most eclipses right, but it's going to make some mistakes. In particular, Mars has a lot of mistakes. In some cases, the Mars gear is quite far off. And the mistakes match exactly the same mistakes we know the Greeks made in their writing and in their math. Also, as I said, it predicts eclipses. And eclipses don't happen over the whole planet at the same time. So you guys might remember there was an eclipse last year. And here where I live in New York City, it was only a partial eclipse. Only part of the sun was covered. But I went up to visit a friend who lives in Rochester, New York, and there it was a full eclipse. So where you are on Earth will depend on what eclipses you can see. And when we look at this Antikythera mechanism, its eclipses work best if you are located on the island of Rhodes, which is also one of the Greek islands. And that probably is the island where this was made. So that makes a lot of sense for an ancient Greek person making this. It doesn't make a lot of sense for aliens. Why would they care about eclipses happening on this one particular tiny island, on this one particular tiny planet? It doesn't really, it's hard to imagine what their motivation would be. So the Antikythera mechanism is essentially a toy. Like, it doesn't teach us anything new about Greek astronomy or Greek mathematics that we didn't know. It shows the same kinds of thought and the same kinds of evidence that we see in their writings. It just is kind of a funner way to demonstrate it, to see it actually moving, as opposed to just seeing it, written down and the math worked out. But it, again, anytime you take away that context, you take away that evidence for other kinds of mechanisms the Greeks built, other things the Greeks knew about the astronomy, when you take away that context, you make it mysterious and you leave a hole there for aliens to come in. I mentioned that this guy, Eric von Däniken, is the guy we can blame for a lot of modern day ancient alien ideas. He has written at least 20 books. Most of them are massive, massive bestsellers. In particular, his first book, which was called Chariot of the Gods. And already in this first book, he has a lot of the same ideas we've talked about, where, who built the pyramids? He talks about Pakal's sarcophagus. Very, very similar to what you still see in YouTube videos, in podcasts today. He came up with a lot of these ideas. This book, Chariot of the Gods, came out in 1968, so quite a long time ago. He is still writing. In 2021, he came out with his most recent book. He is still alive. He's 90 years old now. And he is very, very famous. In fact, they did a survey in England a while ago, and they asked people if they knew the name of any real archaeologist. And Eric von Däniken, was the #1 person people could name, which is just horrifying to me that this guy who is, all about fraud and fakes was the one people knew the best. He is a producer of the Ancient Aliens TV show. He's been on the show quite a few times. They had one whole episode all about him. Some of the things about him that you might not trust him. He has been convicted of fraud. He actually went to prison for a year, and it was in prison where he wrote one of these books. As I said, he continues to write books. His most recent one was titled Confessions of an Egyptologist: Lost Libraries, Vanished Labyrinths, and the Astonishing Truth Under the Saqqara Pyramids. So this was his first book, Chariots of the Gods. And in Chariots of the Gods, he made some very, very basic mistakes. Like, even if you were willing to go along with the whole aliens thing. For instance, he says Pakal's sarcophagus, which again is that one we talked about, this guy, he says this came from the city of Copan. It is actually from the city of Palenque. So they're both Maya cities. It doesn't really affect his theory too much, which city it came from. Aliens could have visited either city. But you would think that would be a very, very easy mistake to fix, because many people over the years have pointed this out to him. And yet, even in the 50th edition, he still hasn't bothered to fix a basic mistake, like what city did this sarcophagus come from? So you can only imagine how many other things he has not corrected and he has not fixed. So we're almost out of time. I just wanted to say briefly, there are real historical mysteries. I understand why it's a lot more exciting to think about mysteries than to think about broken potsherds and broken tools and things like that. But there are real historical mysteries that I think, I wish would get more attention and would get more research, and we could make documentaries about them. One of the real historical mysteries I think it would be very exciting for people to know more about is what's called the Indus script. So the Indus Valley was a civilization during the Bronze Age, so kind of the same time period as the Egyptian pyramids or Mesopotamia. But it was over in India and Pakistan, had a lot of its own cities. It was a very, very large civilization, very wealthy. They have all kinds of cool buildings and cool stuff, but no one has ever translated their writing system. This is what it looks like. Nobody knows what language this is. Nobody even knows what language family it is. There's a lot of different theories, but no one has really proved it one way or the other. And I think it would be very, very fascinating to be able to read this. Another historical mystery I personally really like is the Voynich manuscript. This is this book that is supposedly from Europe in the Middle Ages, but it is written in this mysterious language. No one has ever been able to translate it. People think it might be a code. No one knows what it's a code for. Some of the different theories is that this might have been an early form of Spanish, and that this book was made by a convent of nuns in Spain. Another theory is that this is a form of medieval Hebrew, but written using the Latin alphabet instead of the Hebrew script, and that it came from northern Italy. And another theory is that it actually is Nahuatl, which is the Aztec language, and that it was made in Mexico. So obviously hugely different theories. Not all three of these can be true. Maybe none of them are true. Another very common theory is that this is a fraud, that this is actually only about 100 years old, and the whole thing is fake and just done to get attention. They have radiocarbon dated the paper, And the paper does indeed date to the 1400s. But it is possible that someone recently found blank medieval paper and wrote on it in the modern day as a fake, as a hoax. You know, it's hard to know. No one has been able to prove one way or the other. Is it really from the Middle Ages? Is it recent? If it is ancient, what is it about? What language is it written in? Who made it? All of these questions. And a third mystery I would really like to see more about is Stonehenge. Stonehenge is also one that shows up in Ancient Aliens a lot. I would say it's definitely, my question is not, did aliens build it? We definitely know that aliens did not build it. We have a lot of evidence of it wasn't all built at one time. For example, there were different stages, step by step, where, you know, this is the first phase where it had no stones. The stones came in and were added later. We have evidence of, you know, where the stones came from. We have evidence of like how they got the stones there. Stonehenge is also not unique. There's a lot of other similar ish structures, or whatever you would call it, from throughout England, throughout the UK, throughout places of Europe kind of nearby. So even if we know that like it was humans, but what was, you know, was it a religious place? Was it a political place? What did it mean to them? I think would be a really, really fascinating historical mystery to get more evidence about. So that is the end of my talk, but I would love to take any questions you guys have.
Thank you, Patty. I'm looking. I don't see any questions yet.
Thank you. Ruth says, great program. If any of you guys think of a question later, feel free to email me. Here's my email address here. Or I also have a mail list that you can sign up to hear about future talks I might be giving. I'll go ahead and type that URL in the chat window, so it's easier for you to click on the link. Ivy says, how did, for the pyramids, how did builders get the stones all the way to the top? Great question. What they did was they built ramps, some of them out of dirt, some of them out of wood. So they would build quite high ramps up around the sides to be able to just, you know, push the stones up this ramp. And once they were all in place, they just, if it was wood, they dismantled it. And if it was dirt, they dug it away to reveal the pyramid kind of standing mysteriously all by itself.
Okay. Well, I think that's it for questions, Patty. Thank you so much. Oh, yes, fantastic. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you.
I'm glad you all really enjoyed
Great.
it.
Yes. Thank you so much, Patty.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good night, everyone.